What's going on, guys? My name is Jason Gould, and I'm here with a couple friends. I've got Ian McCarthy, who's going to be doing the podcast here with me. Ian, do you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I don't know what, if anything, we did in terms of introduction in the previous episode, but my name is Ian McCarthy. I don't know what percentage of people are going to know me from the fitness sphere versus philosophy, because I have a bigger presence there. I'm a fitness professional who kind of emphasizes mental health at this point, but I've had an interest in philosophy since I've really had any sense of what it is. And Jason asked me if I wanted to do a podcast, and I said yes, because I figured there was insufficient reason to say no. There's always reason to not do something, but they weren't sufficiently weighty.
Well, there we go. The audio actually on the last recording we did, my voice wasn't captured in any way, so this will actually technically be our first episode.
Awesome. Well, that first episode, it didn't actually exist, obviously.
Oh, well, there we go. Yeah.
Perfect.
So anyway, we're here with our very first guest that we've had on the show. His name's Justin Caouette. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself here?
Sure. Thanks for having me, guys. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Calgary, where I focus on ethics, metaphysics, mostly on the free will debate, and applied ethics. I teach and research mostly.
Awesome. Yeah, so that's kind of going to be the central topic of our conversation today, free will. So I think that, yeah, we should be able to get into some interesting areas here. Maybe I'll start with you, Justin. Is there sort of a general definition of free will in the literature that most people accept, or?
Unfortunately, no. That's one of the main problems. Many people in the debate tend to talk past one another because the starting place tends to be slightly different. But if I had to generalize, I guess I would say that free will means it's up to usness. It's the ability to do or to make a decision between options that we might have. Okay,
awesome, perfect. Ian, anything you want to say about that, or does that sort of work for you?
I really like that definition. That's consistent with, I think that is consistent with what I articulated in the non-existent podcast. Yeah, I think it's the ability to rationally evaluate choices available to you and make a decision on that basis. And then I'm tempted to think there's a behavioral component in terms of ability to follow through on rational decision making. Perhaps we could dig into that.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess the next place to go would be, for you, Justin, what is determinism, and why does it potentially undermine free will?
So the thought behind why determinism undermines free will. So determinism is the thesis that the past and the laws of nature determine any future actions or happenings in the world. So if that's true, then what the argument is that we're not actually rationalizing anything at all. The rationalization already has a predetermined fixed end. So the freedom that we have to do other than what the laws of nature in the past dictate is just simply an illusion.
Okay.
So determinism is supposed to expunge any options that we have, because determinism dictates that there's only one possible outcome.
Okay.
And if there's only one possible outcome, then how can we have control over the outcome itself?
Okay. Fair enough. Ian, I know that you and I, in our non-existent discussion, touched on this. Anything you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that as well. I think the way you phrased it, which was a much better articulation than my initial attempt, was each state of the universe is caused by the previous state. So given any, let's say, state of the universe X, that will entail Y. X cannot cause Z to arise. And similarly, A would entail B, and so on. And so, yeah, in the sense of a particular conception of free will would be inconsistent with that. But I guess I'm getting ahead of the discussion. Once again, we can get into that too.
Yeah, compatibilists would, there's a compatibilist understanding of free will that would allow for So determinism doesn't tell us if Y or Z will follow from X. As long as they're both consistent with the past, then we can say that we're free in doing that. Even though only one of those options is actually going to come to fruition, only one might be determined. Because at the time we don't know, we're epistemically close to that future, we could say that we're free to do any of those options, given that we don't have that information at the time of making the decision.
Now, is that... I wonder if there's I really dislike use of the word logic or logically because so often it just doesn't mean that in practice. But is there potentially a logical problem with that, in that the argument seems to take the form of, because we don't know the outcome, therefore we have freedom, even though fundamentally we don't. So like the fact that it's not clear to, and by the way, I'm a compatibilist, but just in terms of this particular argument, it's not clear to me how not knowing what's going to happen doesn't mean that what's going to happen isn't determined.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So there's a metaphysical question, and then there's an epistemic question embedded within that kind of answer that compatibilists, well, that some compatibilists give. So the fact that we don't know doesn't mean that it changes the fact of the matter, which might be that we don't have any freedom at all. But some people want to separate the two and say, look, but because the epistemic, because we do have that epistemic limitation, we're justified in acting as if.
Right.
And given that we don't know what the laws of the laws and the laws of nature in the past, we don't know exactly what it's going to entail, then we can just kind of go forward and not really worry about this at all. I'm
sorry to backtrack a little bit here. We've been using the term compatibilism. Do you just want to quickly say what compatibilism is?
Sure. Compatibilism is the thesis that determinism and free will are compatible. And likewise, there's another thesis called semi-compatibilism, which a semi-compatibilist would state that even though free will is not compatible with determinism, moral responsibility is. So those are the two main compatibilist views out there. There's semi-compatibilism and compatibilism.
Okay. So for the semi-compatibilists, free will and moral responsibility aren't necessarily tied together. They can sort of come apart, so to speak?
That's right. Okay. Absolutely.
Cool. Are you yourself a compatibilist, or are you a libertarian?
I'm not.
Okay.
Not libertarian with regards to free will.
Okay.
But not a soul-believing sort of libertarian. So there's two different kinds of libertarians. There's an agent causal libertarian, and then there's an event causal libertarian. And I'm more of the agent causal variety.
Okay. Do you want to say more about that and how that's distinguished from someone who, say, accepts the existence of a soul and finds free will there?
Sure. It's a naturalist position, or it's at least compatible with naturalism, an agent causal position. So the agent causal position just says that, look, agents themselves are the causes of actions. It's not the past and the laws of nature that dictate what our actions are. People dictate what they're. So we have constraints. The laws in the past constrain what we could possibly do at a given time, but it doesn't dictate what we do at a given time. Okay. What dictates what we do is what we decide on. So we are the end all be all for our actions, but we can't kind of act outside of the constraints that our upbringing and the laws of nature kind of press on us.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here and just sort of press you on that. But if naturalism, if that's compatible with naturalism, and I'm assuming on your naturalism, I'm assuming on your naturalism, human beings and agents are very much just part of the natural world.
Absolutely.
Yep. So how would their brains, which I'm assuming are responsible for the decisions, not subject to cause and effect in the same way as other non-agent entities?
They are. Good. Great question. I think they are. I think they. So brains don't make decisions, people do, right?
Oh.
So I might get a firing at a given time. So as I'm talking to you, you're asking me a question, and then I have options. The firing allows for only a certain subset of things that I could do at a given moment. So it's excited me to answer the question, but it's also made me skeptical in a sense. So the same firing has done multiple things, and then I get to kind of guide which way I take the firing. So I have the firing, and it's done multiple things for me. It's made me excited to answer your question, and it's made me want to close the computer. Right? Now I have a decision as to what I want to do, and so I've decided to answer and to continue on. I didn't break the laws of nature to do that. That's the naturalism. It's not like my soul just kind of like is coming out of the physical realm and causing something to happen. It's a completely physical description of of exactly what's going on. It's just not a dictated physical description. Yeah. So it's just like sometimes we have dispositions. So like I have a certain character. And so 9 times out of 10, I may say thank you when someone does something nice for me. But 1 time out of 10, I might not. And I want to say that it's up to me. It's not dictated by my character that I say thank you. That's an active decision that I make myself. So the agent themselves are the arbiters of what direction they take the firing, that the process that goes on in their brain. It doesn't dictate that they must do one thing or another. It just dictates that they do one or the other. Yeah, so it's directly connected to the firing that goes on in my brain. It's not some metaphysical, weird. I don't know really the word I'm looking for here, but there's nothing
spooky going on. There's no
background. Yeah, there's nothing really tricky here. There's no soul or some dualism doing the work. For my particular view, though a lot of people, a lot of theists will appeal to souls and things like that in order to justify how human action unfolds. I'm not one of those.
Okay. Well, I do appreciate that your disposition led you to answering the question and not closing your computer. Let's see here.
Do you mind telling me what the question was? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So he mentioned that he. I guess the term would be an agent causal libertarian. Would that be accurate?
Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay. Yeah, basically he's an agent causal libertarian, so he thinks that agents make decisions and they're not necessarily determined by the natural world to make one or the other.
Right.
I do want to ask you, is your position on this sort of tentative till we discover more about the nature of the universe? And what I mean by that is could we find out in a few years that determinism really is true, and that
Yeah.
all of our actions are just the result of impartial events taking place?
Yes, absolutely. My view is contingent on what we can learn about science.
Okay.
So if science was able to explain human action such that it doesn't leave room for free will, then I'd be on board to say that we don't have free will.
Okay.
But as of now, the best scientific theories that we have of the day, those theories are compatible with agent causal accounts of free will, though admittedly the details of what an agent causal account consists of haven't really been cashed out too much in the philosophical literature. Though I would recommend Helen Stewart's. She has a new paper that came out last year. It's called Action as Downward Causation, and where she starts to kind of put some meat on the bones as to what that account looks like. And there's some other scholars in England that are working on this as well, Stephen Mumford, and I forget the other. But yeah, they've got some good work on this, and so these are philosophers of science. These people they take science really seriously. And they think that science doesn't rule out free will.
Okay. You mentioned science, or sorry, our best science right now being compatible with agent causation. Some scientists, I think you would know, would disagree with that. What are people saying in sort of the scientific literature about free will, and why do some of them think that we perhaps don't have it, or that science shows that we don't have it? I'm thinking of, like, say, Benjamin Libet or
Sam Harris.
Sam Harris is another one.
Yeah. So they're claiming that, so in the early 80s, Benjamin Libet, he's at the University of California in San Francisco, I believe. He used EEG to record the brain activity of volunteers who had been told to make spontaneous movements. So with the help of like a precise timer, the volunteers were asked to read, I guess they were read a moment that they became aware of the urge to act. And then Libet found that there was 200 or 300 milliseconds delay on average between the urge and the movement itself. So this is all just to say that the neuroscience, there's been some neuroscience done since the 1980s that suggests that so Libet was able to, at a 60% rate, guess, or 65% rate, predict what the agent would do before the agent themselves knew that they would do it. And he took this, and other neuroscientists have taken this to be evidence that that free will is an illusion, that the firings in the brain are already dictating what we're going to do before we do it. And if that's true, then it's not possible that we can actually have free will.
Okay. Now, to my ear, and I'm sure to a lot of people's ears who first hear this, that sounds pretty compelling. Why is that not necessarily persuasive for you?
Because I think, as Al Mealy, as a philosopher at Florida State University, pointed out, asking someone to spontaneously move in a certain way, that's far different than the process that goes on in the brain when we actually make decisions about whether I should go meet my girlfriend for a drink after this, or if I should go for a second session at the gym.
Oh, okay. Girlfriend, you don't need 2 sessions a day.
Much more. It requires much. There's much more going on in the brain in those times. So until those decisions can be shown that those decisions have been made, because those are the decisions we care about. Because I'm not really sure if I freely put my right foot in front of my left. Nor do I think we should actually care if I put my right if that's free or not. What we really care about is our moral decision.
Okay.
And are those predetermined? Are those can we put can we do the EEG and see those decisions being made ahead of time before I actually have made a decision? Then I would say that that's legitimate science to combat the free will debate. But simple movements, I don't think we should take much from that at all.
Okay.
So is there an assumption at play here that the more complex the decision, potentially the more free the decision? I mean, the assumption that I'm working with here is that the more complex the decision, the more we care about it. So when we have to weigh things, we actually have to weigh values that we have. Those are the decisions that we care about in the free will debate. Like, so if when I get up to go fill up my water jug, certainly I have to put one foot in front of the other. But I don't think we really care how I should decide if I put the left in front of the right or vice versa. And what Libet's experiments are analyzing are those decisions that we don't really care about. Or I would argue that we don't really care much about. There's no moral valence to those decisions.
Okay.
And
go ahead. Yeah.
My apologies for interrupting, but let's grant the hypothetical that we reach the point with neuroscience at which we're able to discern with greater accuracy than 50-50 whether or not someone's going to marry a certain person or something like this. What do you think that would imply in terms of the presence or absence of free will?
So, is your question, how does free will play a role in those major decisions?
Well, let's imagine a Libet experiment in which of course, methodologically, this would likely be impossible. But let's just grant that the experiment isn't, move one hand or the other. It's are you going to go to this school or another for grad school, or are you going to pursue this profession or another? And somehow, based on exclusively looking at brain activity, we're able to discern with, let's say, the 60% reliability, this person is going to go here instead of here. So again, just putting aside any methodological question and granting that that happens. But what do you think that would say, if anything, about free will?
I honestly don't think it says, it wouldn't say anything, because unless it was 100% or close to it, I don't think it says much. All it does is really tell us that when a brain looks like this, when asked this question, it's likely to result in this outcome. But just because something's likely doesn't mean that we've expunged how that process came about. Unless you can show with 100% accuracy that when the brain looks like this, when asked this particular question, this is what will follow. I don't think we can conclude that that we don't have free will. So I think you need the 100% threshold is what's going to be needed, and I find that to be. I just don't think it's possible. I don't see that happening, but it could, theoretically speaking.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Indeed.
So we mentioned Libe. I'm not doing any service here for Canadians.
It won't actually bother me.
I'm not representing Canada well here, but another free will skeptic whose name you mentioned was Sam Harris. Now his position is a little bit different. He actually thinks that free will, just as an abstract concept, is incoherent. He thinks with or without determinism, sort of free will is nonsensical. Do you have any particular thoughts on that? I'm assuming you disagree with Harris.
I do. I've written so I have a blog. It's called A Philosopher's Take. So for those listeners who care to check it out, it's www.aphilosopherstake.com. And there, one of the most downloaded blog posts I have up there, which is it's got about 50 or 60,000 reads, is a response to Sam Harris. And the name of the post is Sam Harris, Why He Should Read More Philosophy.
Thank you. I mean, I really don't think he reads the literature at all.
Yeah, no, that's my complaint. That's my major complaint against Harris. So he doesn't think that free will it makes sense to appeal to it. Yet he does think that lots of other concepts make sense, like reciprocal love, like punishment, like basic desert. So do you believe that someone deserves something for what they do? Do you think people deserve a certain amount of respect just for being a person? So these sorts of things Harris will talk about as if those concepts make complete sense. Yet, to make sense of those concepts, I would argue that you need the free will concept in order to fully comprehend those further concepts that he appeals to without question.
Do you need libertarian free will, or will compatibilist free will get you there?
So I believe you need libertarian free will. I think you need I think the ultimate decision has to be up to you. You have to be the source of the decision in a special way in order to make sense of those concepts. So, for instance, moral obligation. To make sense of the concept of moral obligation, I think you have to assume that the individual has the ability to do the thing that you're obligating them to do.
Okay.
I mean, it wouldn't make much. So if I asked my hat to go get me dinner for the evening, a lot of people would laugh and scoff. They'd say, "Well, what are you doing? You're asking something of a thing that can't do that. That doesn't make any sense." But likewise, if it turned out that we're no different than artifacts in the world, in that things happen to us and we don't actually do things, then it would be odd to kind of obligate anyone to do anything, because they're just going to do what they're going to do regardless. So the whole concept of moral obligation kind of falls out if we don't have free will.
What do you think of moral...
Sorry, go ahead.
What do you think of moral obligation as a practical concept? either implicitly or explicitly not caring about the foundation of it. In other words, one might say we have free will or we don't. However, we have this concept. It's workable. Let's roll with it.
I don't think it's I'd like to hear why they believe that it's workable. So, so here we have this concept of moral obligation. Moral obligation is simply to say that we ought to do a certain action at a given time. Now, I think that we can make sense of that concept without free will, but we can't apply it without the assumption of free will. So I could say something like, ideally, it ought to be the case that there's no racism in the world. That makes sense to me regardless of if there's free will or not. You know, I can compare that world to a world with racism, and the world without racism seems better to me. Therefore, I can conclude that that's a better world regardless of free will. But when we're talking about specific agents and specific agent obligations, so what should Jason do at a specific time, that assumes that Jason has abilities. So if I say Jason's obligated to pay me back the $50 that he gave me, and I want it right now, if Jason only has $45, Jason can't pay me back. And so I don't see, it doesn't make much sense for me to appeal to the obligation or the proposed obligation that he has, because there's no way he can get it to me. So what would be the upshot in talking about obligations in that way?
I want to.
Well, if we
run. Sorry, I was going to say I want to run this by my profs and see if my not having a completed paper sort of gets me out of having to my moral obligation to hand one in. But I don't think they're going to be persuaded by that.
I doubt it, and it's probably because they believe in free will.
Well, I mean,
sorry, go ahead, Ian.
To run with the money analogy, if, let's say someone is, let's use the language, someone's obligated to pay a fine of $500, and they don't have $500. It isn't clear to me how that means they're not obligated to pay it. I mean, they're unable to, but they still have the obligation. They're just not able to meet the obligation.
Yeah, and I guess for me it just doesn't. So they have an obligation to pay $500.
Right.
They don't have an obligation to pay $500 right this second. They have an obligation to pay it when they have it. So you see, so it makes sense to me to say that.
So they have an obligation given a particular circumstance.
Once they have the ability, absolutely. Once they have the money, that money needs to go to the fine because they have an obligation to pay that fine. Right. But if they don't, if they never come up with that money, then it's simply that it's not the case that they ever should give that money because it's not something they'll ever have. So they can't be obligated to give something that you don't have. But you can't have a future obligation if you are able to get that money. What you are obligated to pay it because of whatever transgression occurred in the past. But only when you get the ability to do it, that's when I want to say that you're actually obligated to do the thing. So, for instance, there's a nice example that I use in a paper where you're sitting by the water, and let's assume that you have no use of your arms or legs. You're in a bad accident, and you're sitting in your wheelchair enjoying the day in front of the water, and someone falls in. Someone falls in and they're drowning. It doesn't make sense to me to say that that person has an obligation right then and there to save that person's life. Why doesn't it make sense? Because they can't save that person's life. Now, if that person in a different scenario does have the ability to use their arms and legs, well, then it does seem applicable to say that they have an obligation to save the innocent person because they can. So for me, our abilities kind of dictate what we're obligated to do at any given time. But we can talk about future obligations if we assume that we think that that person will have the ability in the future.
So the underlying assumption...
That's the assumption there. The assumption is based on ability. And as soon as we grant that, then we're already in the free will camp. Like, what kind of ability do you need in order to have the obligation? And that's pretty much just saying, what does free will require?
So the underlying assumption you're working with here is a tiny little principle called Kant's law, or ought implies can, which is from my understanding, basically just says that if an agent is morally obligated to perform an action, then the agent can perform the action. And if the agent morally ought not to perform the action, then he can refrain from performing it. Is that sort of...
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Cool. Perfect. Anything you want to say about that, Ian? Or...
No, I think I agree with the bulk of what's been said so far, so I don't feel I have much to add yet.
Fair enough.
Yeah, so obligation is just one aspect of things that I think free will connects to. But I think that that's a major connection that a lot of people don't recognize the force behind it.
So for you, we mentioned that for compatibilists this is true, but for yourself, do free will and moral responsibility come apart, or no?
I don't believe that they do.
Okay, interesting.
So I think, yeah. So for me, just like moral obligation, one can't be morally responsible for something unless they were free in doing it. So for me, I like to think of, I'm kind of an applied philosopher. So we'll have this theory and we think about it, but I want to put it on the ground and I want to see, okay, what does this really mean when we say things like this? So a nice example I use for to think about moral responsibility and free will is that of like AI and robots. So is a robot morally responsible for what they do, and is a person morally responsible for what they do? And I try to compare the two intuitions that I have in both cases to try to come up with my answer. And for me, the robot isn't morally responsible for what they do because they don't have, and I could go through the entire process, but to sum it up, they don't have the freedom they weren't free in doing what they did. That's why I wouldn't hold them accountable for what they did. Whereas people are free to do what they do, and so if that's true, then they can be morally responsible. Now, to say that they're not morally responsible is just to say that there's lots of different reasons why one couldn't be. One such reason for me is that the decision wasn't up to them. So another example that I use is like, imagine you're on an elevator and someone stomps on your foot. It seems as though you could be like, hey, why'd you do that? And if the person tells you, oh, because I was pushed onto your foot by this other person, it seems as though then they're not morally responsible for the stepping on my foot. It wasn't their fault, so to speak.
Okay.
And so if determinism is true, I see it much like the person who pushed the other person onto your foot. It's only the past and the laws of nature that's doing the pushing rather than another agent.
Okay. A couple of interesting points there. You mentioned robots and AI, and your intuition was that if I heard you correctly, was that robots or sufficiently intelligent AI, English. Anyway, basically the robot can't be morally responsible. Is that an accurate representation of your view?
Yes.
What about data? I mean, presumably that's the question. Yeah. What about a sufficiently advanced robot that based on any external assessment displays the capabilities of a cognitively normal person?
Mm-hmm. Not morally responsible, in my view.
Interesting.
Who is morally responsible is the creator of data.
Now, I'm curious about this because if we're assuming that mental states are necessarily connected to brain states, the assumption I'm working with here, why isn't it the case that an AI could, in principle, not be morally responsible if they were sufficiently advanced? Or intelligent, sorry, sufficiently intelligent.
Yeah, good.
Well, I apologize for interrupting, but is the corollary to that if a robot were sufficiently advanced and mental states are entirely determined by brain states, I mean, would that mean that if we can build a good enough robot, it would have mental states? It would have actual mental states?
Well, sorry, no. My question was really poor. Well, maybe my question was really poorly worded. Basically, what I'm curious about is that what's so special about the organic goo that it is my brain that sort of the hardware of a computer couldn't work with?
Yeah, no, that's great. So I like the way that you put it the second time. It's much more clear. What's so special about us is pretty much what you're asking. So what separates us from that program? So I'd argue that we aren't programmed in the same way that an AI is programmed. So an AI is programmed to do certain things given certain stimulus. Now, the past and our upbringing program us in a sense. But it doesn't dictate one outcome, or it doesn't dictate one possible outcome. Whereas any kind of AI that you're going to use, I don't know how you would be able to program in a way that would allow it. It would either be random. It would either be, so if they have multiple stimuli, then it's programmed to just randomly select amongst its options. And if it's randomly selecting, then it's not up to them in a special way. Whereas I want to say that when we select, it is up to us. So I get the brain firing, boom, I have my options, I can continue with the conversation or close my computer, I select to continue the conversation. And that selection isn't because of a program, it's because I've decided, so I'm always becoming, I have some views on personal identity that kind of coincide with this. It's that every time we make a decision, we are further becoming more of who we want to be. And that's what it means to be human. We do things in the world, whereas AI, they are a product of their program. And if it can be shown that we are on the same thing, if the same goes for us, then I'd bite the bullet and say, absolutely, then we're not morally responsible either. But science hasn't showed us that yet.
Okay. Now, if we were able to develop an AI who was conscious, would that AI then be capable of free will, or no?
Again, I don't see how we can't just trace all of the decisions that the AI makes to the program itself.
Okay.
And so if everything goes back to the program, then it's the programmer who's morally responsible for anything that the actions of the robot, and then, or it's going to be randomness as to why the robot did what it did, and if it's just simply randomness that's occurring, because that's what it was programmed to. It was programmed to kind of in tough situations to randomly select between options. Then I don't see why we should hold the robot accountable for that, because it wasn't up to the robot. It was just a random selection based on the program it was given. So either way, it doesn't. It depends on. I don't really see how it could be morally responsible unless it became conscious. But then we'd have to discuss what it means to be conscious and what and what makes a conscious being different than a non-conscious being.
Would you say it's accurate to describe your position as being that the default should be to assume we aren't programmed in the way a computer program or a robot would be? And if that is the default, why would that be the default as opposed to assuming that we are?
Good. I think that's the default for all of us. I think that's why we treat people differently than we do artifacts in the world, because we think there's something special about being human. And same thing with animals and with robots as well. If you do a trolley case and on one side of the tracks is a robot and the other side is a live animal, we would think there was something wrong with an individual who would choose to smash the animal instead of the robot. And so I think this is an intuition that we all share, and so I'm trying to make sense of that, rather than just, I'm not like nitpicking my own kind of worldview. I think it's the kind of worldview we all share, and that's kind of how I could explain why we treat people differently than we do other beings in the world or other artifacts. But it's a good question to ask. I mean, it's a legitimate question. Are we programmed like robots or not? We have evidence when we have a robot, we know it's been programmed by a person. We don't. There's a gap in our knowledge about our own beginnings as well. So it's really, we don't have that same evidence. So until we do, we shouldn't treat ourselves the same as we do robots. I guess that would be my position.
I guess I'm curious why that sort of gap in our knowledge about our own programming, so to speak, regarding evolution and natural selection. I'm curious why that gap sort of is able to, how do I want to phrase this? I'm curious why, for us, we're not determined or random in the same way that a robot would be. Why that sort of gap in our knowledge is able to keep free will for us there.
Yeah, so for me, the gap, that's where the room lies for free will. That doesn't mean that we have it, per se.
Okay.
Things could be random. Things could be determined.
Okay.
But things could also be up to us in a special sort of way.
Okay.
So if we think that we do things in the world, and we think things happen to us in the world, so there's a doings happenings distinction that I like to appeal to. If we think that there's an actual distinction to be made there, then it seems that that gap that we're trying to make sense of, we already have really heavy intuitions about how that gap ought to be explained. It seems that we want to say what we're saying when we have a distinction between a doing and a happening, is that the doings are up to agents and the happenings are not.
Okay.
And the AI, it's always something happening to them. It's their program.
Okay.
Where in many cases it might be our program too, but it seems like there's the evidence to kind of prove that is far from convincing.
Okay. You mentioned previously that for you, moral responsibility is necessarily connected to free will.
Yes.
There are people who would disagree with you. I'm thinking of Harry Frankfurt, for example. What would a Frankfurt type scenario be, and why would somebody use it to say that free will and moral responsibility can come apart?
Good. So in a Frankfurt type case, the goal is to show a case where the person doesn't have free will, yet we believe that they're still morally responsible for what they do. So Frankfurt scenarios go something like this. They ask you to consider multiple cases. So case one is just your everyday case. An individual decides of their own free will, or it seems to be their own free will, to smack Johnny for getting loud with him at the bar. That's scenario one. Scenario two, we change it a little bit. We say, imagine that a neuroscientist implanted an individual with a chip, and if they decide that they're going to smack Johnny, or if they can tell via the chip if the person will smack Johnny or not when Johnny gets loud with him that evening. Let's say that Johnny has the propensity to do this, so the neurosurgeon has something against Johnny, so he wants to make sure that Johnny's going to get smacked. So he implants our agent with a chip, and when the brain gets to a point where it looks like it's going to Johnny's going to smack, then they don't have to worry about kind of setting the chip off, so to speak. So they could hit a button, and the button would activate, making the agent smack Johnny. But and so Frankfurt wants to say in these sorts of cases, like, look, if let's say the person goes to the scenario and they actually they decide that they're going to smack Johnny, and they do. So the neuroscientist never has to press the button to make him smack Johnny. But they didn't have the ability not to smack Johnny in this case, because whether they decided to or not, they have a chip in their brain that would activate if they decided against smacking Johnny. So there's no scenario in which Johnny doesn't get smacked here. So the intuition's supposed to be, look, the agent is still morally responsible. Nothing has changed. They still, because they wanted to, their own desires kind of made them smack Johnny. So the presence of the chip doesn't really change the fact of the matter. So what's that that's supposed to show us? That regardless of if the presence of you have a choice or not, we still would want to hold you accountable for your action in the same way we do in the first case.
Well, if we dig into that, I think this gentleman who assaults the other person is responsible because they decided to do that. So if you really, I guess I'm not seeing what the force of this argument is, given it strikes me as extremely intuitive and not controversial. I mean, if we don't just assess moral responsibility and someone's ethical quality and so on the basis of behavior. I mean, someone might do something that we perceive to be very unethical, and then they were drugged by someone else. Right. So the fact that their reasoning faculties were drastically impaired, or or potentially not functioning would cause them to not be morally responsible, and so on. So in other words, it saying that this person didn't have a choice not to hit the person, well, I don't see how that's relevant. What matters is, did they have the ability to decide not to?
Exactly. And so people who buy Frankfurt's case, that's exactly what they said. They completely agree with what you said. They said, so what Frankfurt's supposed to be showing is that we don't need the ability to do otherwise in order to be held morally responsible for what we do.
In other words, we don't need freedom.
Well,
freedom of a certain kind.
Yes. So that's where I kind of jump off a bit. So
I was going to say, obviously, your intuition here is that you don't agree with Frankfurt.
I don't think the Frankfurt cases are showing us exactly what they intend to show us. I don't think that they're showing us that we don't need freedom.
Okay. Do you want to say why?
Yeah, because I still think it's still up to the agent in the case. So in the Frankfurt case, in the second scenario, when there's a chip in the person's brain, as long as it wasn't activated by the individual, then it was still up to them to smack him or not. So if they would have decided that they didn't want to, and they would have done it anyway because the chip would have made them do it, well, then they wouldn't have been morally responsible for what they did. But the fact that they actually did decide on their own free will to do the thing, I want to say, of course, they're morally responsible. And the fact that the chip was there, that doesn't really change the fact of the matter, because ability to do otherwise isn't really the best way to cash out the sort of freedom that we care about.
Interesting. Okay.
It's up to usness that really matters.
Well, because think about it. The term is free will, so you could rephrase that as freedom of the will. That's different from freedom of behavior. I mean, you could. It's very easy to conceive of making a decision to do something and being constrained by some external force, but that you aren't responsible for that external force. That's right. But you're responsible for the decision, regardless of the outcome.
That's right.
I mean, this then gets into. I'm realizing this gets heavily into moral philosophy in terms of how do we assess, if someone is a pure consequentialist, then they might actually say that the decision doesn't matter. I just think that's wrong.
As do I. No, but I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a nice way to kind of summarize what's going on here. But a lot of the Frankfurt people, free will has been often understood as simply the ability to do otherwise. And so these cases are supposed to show us, well, there is no ability to do otherwise because the chip's there, and it would be the case that you can't do other than hit the person at the bar. That's what's going on here. So if ability to do otherwise is what's needed, it's not present in the Frankfurt second case. Therefore, you don't really need the ability to do otherwise in order to be morally responsible. Therefore, moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. That's the move. And I want to press that last claim. I'd say, not so fast. That doesn't really follow. Because the way I define free will as being up to me in a special sort of way, this isn't a counterexample to that view.
Now, what about the case in which the individual, I'm thinking of somebody, say, suffering from a tumor on their amygdala, or say someone, either a sociopath or a psychopath. What if their goals and intentions and desires are their own, so to speak? They're not externally planted by a neuroscientist with a chip, but rather because of whatever sort of physical abnormality they suffer from, their goals, desires, and intentions are their own. Are they still morally responsible, or are they how does that sort of tie into a Frankfurt case?
Great question. So this is an ongoing debate in the philosophical literature as well right now. Are psychopaths morally responsible for what they do? Are addicts morally responsible for what they do, given that they suffer from addiction? Psychopaths are claimed to lack empathy, so this is a section of the brain that we think is necessary for moral decision making. So if they are lacking this internal apparatus that would allow them to see something as moral or not, and they don't have that available to them, how can we hold them accountable for their actions in the same way that I might hold you accountable? So it's a good question. I'd say that they are morally responsible for what they do as long as it's up to them. So if there's illness, so there are going to be certain mental illnesses that exculpate our responsibility. But I don't think psychopathy or addiction is one of those. So one example would be schizophrenia. If I have a hallucination, and so what's presented in front of me is a woman dying, but it's really a woman just saying hi. That kind of illness that negatively affects my epistemic access to a given situation, that's going to kind of exculpate me, because I believe that we have an epistemic condition on our moral responsibility. And so if you have an illness that negatively affects your epistemic status, that's going to exculpate you. But it's not clear to me exactly. So there are usually 3 conditions on moral responsibility, or a variation of these 3 conditions. So if we want to say someone's not morally responsible, we have to point to what condition they're not meeting. So there's a control condition. Did the person do what they wanted to do of their own free will? Did they know what they were doing? Did they know like what it would entail? So a lot of times, like small children are not going to be morally responsible because they fail the epistemic condition. And then there's an authenticity condition that's less discussed in the literature, but it's focused on was it up to me in a certain sort of way. So it's not clear to me exactly why we would think the psychopath doesn't meet these conditions. So what my old professor Ish Haji.
So sorry, could you go back over the 3? You don't need to explain them; just list them. I think that's the first.
Sure. There's the so the 3 conditions on moral responsibility are the epistemic condition, the control condition, and the authenticity condition. So if an agent is morally responsible for what they, or isn't morally responsible for what they do, it's because they fail one of these conditions. So to justify them really briefly, we think that agents are morally responsible when they have control over what they do, when they know what they're doing, and when the action arises from their own desires and beliefs, not some that have been implanted by some neuroscientist or something like that.
I'm curious about the second condition you mentioned, the control condition. So I'm thinking of a case where, suppose I'm suffering from a tumor on my amygdala, and I go on, a murderous rampage because I'm just sort of overcome with rage, and this isn't in line with my character or who I am or who I've been my whole life, but I'm sort of just I'm compelled to by these feelings of rage. Would that exculpate me from responsibility, or would, like, in your view, would that eliminate the control condition, something like a tumor?
It could. It would have to be shown that you'd had no other options than to kill. So if the illness has made it such that you have an uncontrollable impulse to kill because it's pressing on the part of the brain that affects impulsivity, then you would be exculpated. But this case is much different than the psychopath case, I would argue, because though they are impulsive, they show restraint in their abilities. So that's why many psychopaths are often not. They evade police quite well. They manipulate others quite well because they know how to navigate. They have options. They don't just kill instantly. They do it strategically. And that, to me, shows that they have control, or minimal amount of control, in their actions, which is why I think they could be held morally responsible.
Okay, sorry, go ahead, Ian.
I would just briefly add, with us having agreed to not dig into this too much, but it's within the psychopaths, and obviously that's speaking broadly, but have the ability to behave as normal, ethical persons. When they don't as a function of not believing in or desiring to hold themselves to what we regard as the obligation to behave morally. and that's arising because of a lack of empathy, but they're able to. And there's emerging literature showing that if it is explained to not what it means for someone to be a psychopath is somewhat controversial, but in just taking persons who, in fact, the literature I'm thinking of, they were looking at narcissists, but the same trait of lack of empathy is present. They took normal persons, low narcissists and high narcissists, in other words, people with normal levels of empathy, diminished, and then very diminished. And in the case of the persons with diminished empathy, they explained to them logically how to approximate empathy. Envision yourself as being this person in this situation. And their brain activity began to mimic that of normal persons. Right. So that would really speak to, perhaps more than anything, knowledge of your behavior.
That's right.
If you were to have a full-blown psychopath and it's explained to them, you're a psychopath. This is what these are the traits you're going to have, the behaviors to which you're going to be predisposed. Here's how you can combat them. If they were to then still behave as a quintessential psychopath, yeah, I think at the very least, it becomes a lot harder to argue they aren't responsible for their behavior. Right. And I mean, truth be told, I know people who have very diminished empathy. And one person in particular has told me they don't feel empathy, but that basically as a coping mechanism as a child, they themselves came up with this kind of system of trying to imagine being other people. And so they're able to operate normally as a result, even though they don't feel empathy as a visceral response. I guess I just wanted to give a lecture about psychopathy and narcissism, but hopefully that was some... Could I speak to the amygdala tumor issue?
You may.
Thank you. I couldn't tell if you were actually bothered, but so traditionally I've said no, the person with a tumor pressing on their amygdala wouldn't be responsible, but I think I might have to revise that a little bit, in that in someone who doesn't have amygdala dysfunction, more than anything, the amygdala is implicated in fear, and the frontal cortex, for lack of a more technical term that I'm not remembering, restrains the amygdala, but then the amygdala actually impairs the functioning of the frontal lobe, so it goes back and forth. That's in a normal person. So if someone has a tumor on their amygdala that ramps up the fear response, that isn't something completely artificial. It's not introducing something that isn't present at all. It's increasing a particular negative response. So I guess my position would have to be something like the degree to which someone is responsible is dependent on the severity of the tumor and the degree to which it causes the amygdala to additionally impair reasoning. But yeah, I could actually envision someone having a tumor on their amygdala with causing a massively disproportionate fear response and impairing their reasoning and behavior, but they would still be responsible to some extent, because it isn't like you have removed their prefrontal cortex. Like they're totally incapable of executive functioning or something like this. So
assuming there are certain conditions that would exculpate somebody from being responsible, you mentioned schizophrenia as one of them, potentially, I think.
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to say that schizophrenics are not morally responsible for any of their behavior.
But
I just
certain actions.
Yeah, I was pointing to a specific case in which the diagnosis where it causes hallucinations, and so if a hallucination was at play at a given time during when someone was deciding to act, then that could exculpate them in those scenarios.
So there are certain scenarios where certain conditions will exculpate somebody.
Yep.
Okay. Now, I'm curious about that. Everyone's favorite philosopher, Sam Harris, has this nice phrase.
Not a philosopher.
Not a philosopher. Thank you.
he has this phrase. It was in reference to the tumor on the amygdala case, actually, where he says that basically, if we understood the brain well enough, we would see that it's just tumors all the way down. Is the phrase that he uses. I'm not sure if you've heard him say that.
Yeah, I have.
But basically, that if we understood the brain well enough, we would see that, regardless of whether or not somebody had a tumor, their very own biology or their brain is what's dictating their actions. And so if we understood the brain well enough, then essentially everyone would be exculpated in the same way they would be if they had a tumor on their amygdala. I'm assuming you obviously disagree with his view there. Yeah. Do you want to?
Can we, just as a cheap shot, can we note for the record that Sam Harris didn't carry out his doctoral research? Like, he literally didn't do it. This is in his thesis.
He doesn't have his PhD?
No, he has a PhD, but he didn't do the research.
Oh yeah. Well, that's not surprising. If you read his free will pamphlet, I won't call it a book. If you read his pamphlet, you'll notice he doesn't do much research in the philosophical literature either.
Oh boy,
he's consistent.
I wonder how we all feel about Sam Harris. But yeah, sir, do you want to say why you aren't persuaded by his nice little phrase there?
Yeah, the tumor's all the way down. I like the phrase. He's good at phrases. I think that's why. I mean, he's a really intelligent guy, so I'm sure that's why he gets as many followers and as much attention as he does. Yeah, the tumor's all the way down just assumes that a certain view of human agency, without argument. It assumes that determinism is true. So it begs the question against the individual who wants to press against that. So I want to say it's possible that determinism is true, but it's possible that it's not. And so if it's not true, then it won't be tumors all the way down. The only way it's tumors all the way down is if determinism is true.
Okay.
So if we do understand the brain the way that if we knew everything about the brain, then we would know if we have free will or not that we don't have free will.
Okay.
It's a jump to say that we don't. I think he's right to say that if we knew more about the brain, if we knew everything there was to know about every firing and how it occurs, then we would know if we had free will or not. But we wouldn't necessarily not have it. And that's just an assumption he builds in.
Oh, so if that phrase were sort of extended into a formal argument, it would beg the question, essentially.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, and something else I want to note that, and truthfully, I think I just had this thought now, so I haven't further worked on it, but thinking about that phrase, tumors all the way down, and if we knew enough about the brain, we would be able to show this neurobiological state led to this one, and so on, led to this behavior. So that's an explanation. That is that would be a mechanistic explanation of someone's behavior. It's not clear to me how that tells us whether or not someone has free will. Like explaining, like taking a behavior or something, and this is essentially the argument made by Sean Carroll. You know, if you're able to explain baseball and all of the details of it at the lowest level possible in terms of mechanisms and so on, does that entail that baseball doesn't exist? That it isn't its own independent, real phenomenon, even though maybe we could even explain the precise movement of every molecule of every player and so on. So saying this is what occurred in the brain, it seems to me it might be an additional step to then say, therefore this person had no free will. What if that is what the brain does when someone makes a free choice?
No, excellent, Ian. What's missing, I think, is prediction. So explanation plus if you could predict what the person was going to do, now that you had the knowledge of everything that's going on in the brain, then it would be really tough to show that you have free will. Because we think that freedom, it's a decision that's made by us. So if you're going to be able to tell me what I'm going to do, everything that I'm going to do prior than when I do it, how free am I really? So you might still call the process that goes underway that's the free process or something like that. But again, it would just be a semantic kind of claim at that point for me, because what freedom would we actually have if you could predict all of my actions 100% of the time just by looking at and understanding the brain to its full potential? I think in theory we could, all of the knowledge of the brain, we could use that to kind of test if we have free will or not. But I don't think that's the knowledge. I think you're right. I don't think the knowledge in itself can give us the answer to if we in fact have free will or not.
Do you?
Sorry, go ahead, Ian.
Well, I was just going to ask. This is kind of like the question of divine foreknowledge and whether or not that, if God knows everything that's going to happen, therefore we don't have free will. I actually don't buy that, because I just don't see the causal mechanism. I don't see any means by which. So let's put aside that question and let's speak to predictability. I don't see how predictability, being able to predict something, therefore entails that the thing that is predicted isn't free. I mean,
good. Oh, yeah. Let me just be clear. 100% predictability was what my claim.
Sure.
If you could predict all of my things before I did them. So in the God case, it's interesting because he created us. So it's almost like we're back in AI land, right?
Right.
So here we have humans, but we're pretty much just like robots, right? We have a programmer, and he programmed us to do those things. And so he's telling us what we're going to do, or whatever your God is, a she or an ant, is telling us what we're going to do 10 years from now. So, and if it's true that he's all-knowing, he knows. He's not just predicting, I think this will happen. He knows that will happen. In what way am I free not to make that occur? In what way am I free to pick a different person to marry rather than the person he says I'm going to? It's difficult for me to wrap my head around what that freedom would look like, if in fact, because for me to have freedom is to settle the fact of the matter ourselves. So we are the settlers, so to speak. But if it was already settled before we were born, in what way are we settling it? In an interesting sort of way.
Well, I never thought I would be defending William Lane Craig, but here we go. Craig's answer to your question is just that it's our free action that determines God's foreknowledge, not the other way around. God's foreknowledge doesn't determine our action. That's sort of how he deals with middle knowledge and all that.
Yeah, I tend to be to find that convincing. I would note that I do think there's a good argument to be made for God nonetheless being responsible, in that he created the universe knowing what the outcome would be, and if we grant that everything is contingent, then he could have created a different universe that would have entailed different consequences. Now, narrowing it back to free will and predictability, certainly there's a difference between, let's say that you know someone extremely well, and they are extremely consistent in their behavior and their responses to certain contexts and so on. So in 95% of scenarios, you're able to predict their behavior with confidence almost precisely. Now, I certainly recognize that there is a real distinction, at least in degree, between that and I know exactly what you're going to do every millisecond until you die. But my question would be, okay, so there's a difference in degree. There exists a real difference between those two scenarios, but how does that difference lead to the conclusion there's no free will, as opposed to there is free will, we just have an unbelievable ability to assess what's going to happen in the future based on what is true now?
So the 95% case, I think that doesn't show us that we don't have free will. But the every molecule case, the every single one, if you can give me an explanation for exactly why I did what I did, and why I'm going to do all that I'm going to do before I do it, and then I actually do all those sorts of things, it's tough for me to see. I guess theoretically, I guess I could still be free. It would just be a really interesting coincidence, I suppose. I mean, I guess so. So I know what you're saying. So there's this all-knower, my best friend, who just knows everything about me inside and out, and they know everything about the brain, and they've seen scans of my brain, so they know exactly how I'm going to respond to the question that you're going to ask. So they're going to write down all the answers. So let's say you wrote down your questions ahead of time, and they've seen your questions, and they know me so well, and they've been looking at my brain since birth, and so they're going to go ahead and answer them for me in the way that I would. And so they wrote them all down, and they showed you before we got into the interview. And then you sat down, and you're looking at the answers, and you're comparing. and it's a 100%. Even as many times as I said which has probably been a lot. Every single one they predicted. To me, that doesn't show that I don't have free will per se. It's just, if we had that ability, it's quite suggestive that we don't. I'd be almost willing to say that that's proof for me that we wouldn't, that we don't have free will. That I'm just the result of whatever character I have up until a certain time, and I want to say our characters aren't fixed. So that no one would actually be able to do that. I want to say that because we have free will, that it disallows someone to be able to predict everything that we could possibly do. So those two things are going to be incompatible, on my view, because of the kinds of beings that we are. We're always kind of on a path, so to speak, and we can always get off that path at any given moment, and we tend to. No path is exactly, so no one's ever going to be able to predict all of our behaviors if that's true. The only way they would be able to do that is if determinism was true.
One of the last things I wanted to ask you here as we come to the end of our time, I guess. Why aren't you persuaded by people who argue that free will is incoherent just as an abstract concept? So people who want to say, look, either determinism is true, in which case we aren't free, or if determinism isn't true, then there's just sort of this quantum indeterminacy that takes place. And in either scenario, it seems like we don't have free will. So on the one hand, determinism is true and we can't do other than we do, or on the other hand, our actions are just random in a sense. Why aren't you persuaded by people who make those arguments?
So Dirk Perboom is like the philosopher who comes to mind. Greg Caruso is another good philosopher who holds his position. I'm not persuaded because even Dirk Perboom himself admits that the agent causal picture, though unlikely according to him, is still up for grabs. So it's given that it's a possible way that we could describe the way the world is, agent causation is a legitimate thing, then we have some options here. We could be a skeptic about free will, or we can be an agent causalist, or we could be a compatibilist. These are three options. I think they're all live options right now. Even the skeptic says this. So now we have to decide which one we're gonna choose. And for me, I look at our practices. I look at my relationships with other individuals, and it seems that I'm assuming lots of times throughout my relationships that people have freedom. And if the practices that I'm involved in, practices of punishment, of moral obligation, genuine apology, which we haven't discussed, but that's another concept I think is directly connected to free will. I think that the stakes in the free will debate are very high because I think free will is connected to these other concepts that we all find very important. And when the stakes are high, the evidence that you need to make your claim also goes up. So your evidence that you're going to need to show that free will skepticism is true is so high because the stakes are so high in the free will debate that the free will skeptic can't actually meet that bar. And so for me, when I have these three live options, that's how I decide on what kind of, if we have free will or not, is based on those stakes. And so in the philosophical literature, in the epistemic literature, this is called pragmatic encroachment. So there's a philosopher here at the University of Calgary who's written a book on this, him and Matt McGrath, Jeremy Fantle, where they think this is how epistemic justification works. That the stakes matter in a given scenario as to what you're justified in believing. And so because I think the stakes are so high in the free will debate, I conclude that you can't hold that free will skepticism is true. So the only available options to us given the stakes in this sorts of debate is compatibilism or libertarianism. And so I'm not convinced by the skeptic for those reasons.
Okay.
But I'm not convinced of compatibilism for different reasons.
What would you say to the free will skeptic who just says, look, like I buy your arguments that everything we care about essentially goes out the window, forgiveness, blameworthiness, praiseworthiness, all those things, yep. But says we've been living forever as if and even if free will didn't exist, we've been living forever as if it did, and all these concepts have sort of been able to be implemented into our daily lives, even if they are just an illusion. Why can't we continue living that way going forward, even as a free will skeptic?
Because I think that our practices need to be justified, because lots of our practices harm people. And so I have the basic kind of, if you're going to harm someone, you just should have good justification for doing so. And so I don't see how the free will skeptic will be able to offer that justification. Yeah, I guess that's how I respond. So there's two different kinds of skeptics. There's the optimistic free will skeptic. That's the one who thinks that not having free will is a good thing. That's the Derek Perboums and the Greg Carusos of the world. And then there's a pessimistic free will skeptic who thinks, that's the kind of theory that you just described. The free will skeptic says, yeah, all those things are they should go, actually, and we should just ground our practices differently. And then I'd say, well, how do you plan on grounding those practices, or how do you plan on developing new ones? And then they just scratch their heads. And then I say, okay, well, given that there's a live option here, admittedly, they admit it themselves that agent causation is a live option. Then we ought to go with we ought to go with that worldview, given that it does ground our concepts, all things being equal.
Very nice. Well, is there anything left you wanted to ask, Ian?
No, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you coming on, Justin.
Really good questions, and it's a nice back and forth. Yeah, anytime you guys want to discuss anything philosophical in nature, whether it be ethics or free will or vegetarianism or enhancement, I'd be more than happy to link up for a couple hours and go back and forth.
Absolutely. Well,
totally. I'll send Jason all the literature on psychopathy, and then we can really dig into that.
Yeah, that'd be fun. That was my first publication, so it's very dear to me. And I have a background working with, for 5 years, I was a residential group home manager, and most of the residents that we had, of the 200 residents, many of them had, they couldn't be diagnosed with psychopathy at the time, but many of them went on to be psychopaths. So I have a lot of experience working with
as if it's like a future endeavor.
Right, good life goal.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Justin. I really appreciate having you on. I know that I speak for both Ian and myself when I say that. So,
yeah, anytime, guys. It was a good time. So, anytime.
Cheers. Well,
absolutely.
Thanks for anyone who made it this far in the discussion. I really appreciate you guys listening. Again, my name's Jason Gould, and I was joined today by my two guests. Well, my one guest. Ian's my co-host.
I can be a guest.
But yeah, so again, our philosophy podcast is Philosophize. So if you guys want to check it out, look forward to or look for more episodes in the future.
All right, take care, guys.
Cheers.